So this clearly is the desktop for today, July 26th, 2022. And it refers, obviously, this is slices of red velvet cake, and so it refers to the Juneteenth celebrations. And so this image as communication, if we take it as communication, as a message from whatever source, whatever intelligent entity, algorithm, ghost in the machine, hacker, and other intentionality. If we take it as a message, obviously relates, somehow to the discourse concerning Juneteenth. And in that sense, it's, over a month late as a message. But it can also be taken as an inquiry. The meaning of certain images that I select for these rotating desktop pictures isn't always entirely clear, or my interpretation of these images isn't necessarily always on the surface. And in some ways, this image as it's presented here and today, I think, belongs to this ongoing discussion of the role of context in determining the nature of meaning in various sorts of message systems. And in a certain way, perhaps, we can relate what I do with this desktop Ekphrasis to our ongoing construction of the new variation of the space-time travel communication coordinate machine. And I want to begin with the story that this particular image might represent, or what it symbolically represents to me. So first of all, there are these slices of red velvet cake laid out, and then you notice that the plates, the serviceware doesn't match, and already before we get to the blue cobalt design plate, we're already hinting at potentially, a reference to the work of Julie L. Green, and you notice the napkins don't match either. So this formal, the formal elegance of the cake and of the way that it's presented, and the lovely patterns in the flatware and on the plates themselves, refer to the significance of the event and the occasion and the gathering, and the mismatched presentation, for me, creates an image of making do with the materials on hand. So a kind of resourcefulness, and also perhaps these plates and these forks, and these napkins and towels that are being used for the service belong to different people. So there's a kind of a hint of community and communal organization and labor that belongs to the image for me as well. And then when we get to this image, the narrative takes on, some deeper meanings and dimensions. And, I read that circle of blue cobalt paint as a reference to Julie L. Green and her work recording the requests of last meals of inmates on death row, and she would paint these requested meals on this the designs that she created would represent these last meals, and she would paint them on plates that she had purchased at various thrift stores and bargain venues, and this series was referred to as Last Suppers, and in addition to providing a sociology of those individuals on death row, it obviously made a reference to this famous passage from the Christian Gospels, in which Christ presents and frames this last meal that he has in terms of this communal blessing of himself as the body of the church, and the red velvet cake, right? In that context, looking at this particular image is very hard for me not to see as an image of blood. And then with the white stripes of the frosting between the layers of the cake, it's hard not to see the red and white stripes of the U.S. flag, right? And so this particular, and then surrounded by the blue, it's easy to translate these flowers. I don't know what types of flowers they are. They appear to be more than one variety of flower here, but I'm not entirely certain. But this floral design is once we see the red and white stripes, once we see the blood, and once we see that element of the flag, it's easy to translate this blue circle of this kind of mandala into an image of the stars of the American flag, the white stars in the background of the blue field, and therefore also becomes a representation. These floral designs, or this floral circle, becomes a representation in my mind of the individual states, and then that itself, that if we go there and we see the blue ring as a representation of the states that constitute the United States, then I suppose we can go even further, and we can ask questions of these individual flowers as states, and question, how many individuals who might have had the opportunity to celebrate a future Juneteenth were executed, on following their request for a last meal on death row. And then there's a further detail, and this is perhaps the most remarkable detail of all for me, is the fact that, and I'll examine each of the forks individually. You see that this fork is clean; it hasn't been utilized. This one is too, although it's penetrating the red velvet cake, but it hasn't been eaten from yet. This is rather the placement of the fork on the plate. Same here. This one is a little less clear, but I don't believe that it's been eaten from. Perhaps it has. This crumb over here suggests that it may have been. And this fork again is another clean fork. And the image of the cake, other than the blue ringed reference to Julie Green plate, this is the only cake that may have been eaten from. And it's in this opposite position. We're not really doing a Gramscian diagram here, or Gramscian rectangle, and it would be odd if we did in a way, because we have 6 elements rather than 4, but it's in the opposite diagonal corner if we were doing a Gramscian diagram, and you can see that this fork clearly has been eaten from, and therefore if this is the plate that represents an individual who was either on death row or symbolically, somehow refers to someone on death row, the surface level of the story is something of quite remarkable, because somehow this individual, condemned to death, if we allow my reading, my symbolic reading, and the context that I've brought to it, has received some kind of liberation, and has joined the company of this celebration, and of course there are individuals, right, that have been condemned to death, and turned out to be innocent, and as we've discussed many times, the systemic racism of the justice system, and we say justice system in quotation marks, in the United States, has always, since the inception of the justice system in the United States, been biased towards the execution of people of color, and not in small percentages either, but rather large percentages, which is why many of us have for many years made an issue of the inherent systemic racism within the criminal justice system, particularly as it pertains to the death penalty. And as you know, close readers of my work will know that it was actually in Washington, D.C., in front of the steps of the Supreme Court building, that in protest of the racist dimensions of the death penalty, that I first met, my teacher, or who is arguably, the most important teacher who I've ever had, Dennis Brutus, and in that meeting, the connections between the oppressive violence of apartheid regimes as had existed in South Africa before the end of apartheid, and oppressive regimes and systems, whether judicial or institutional in other ways, legislative and interpolative systems, that the relationships and the connections between those systemic systems of injustice in their various forms, really fully developed in my consciousness through the connections that Dennis was able to clarify, both in his life and in the actions of his work. And so this is a list of 18 people who have been proven innocent and exonerated by DNA testing in the United States after serving time on death row. And they represent 11 states, these 18 individuals. And so if we imagine these flowers, there should be 11 varieties of this blue circle of flowers here, if we imagine them as representations of the stars that represent individual states. So perhaps there are 11 varieties perhaps there are 11 varieties of flowers here, and within those 11 varieties, perhaps there are 18 representations of individual flower blossoms. And I'm not entirely sure why there are three stripes, but perhaps that remains open to interpretation in this narrative. And this perhaps is one of the representations of someone who was freed and exonerated by this evidence. But I will simply read as a kind of Destop Ekphrasis the stories of or the statements that serve as representations of these freedoms and liberations and and the relevance, of them to this image, should be clear. While I focus on this image. Kirk Bloodworth served 8 years in Maryland prison, including 2 years on death row for a murder and rape he didn't commit, before he was exonerated in 1993. Rolando Cruz and his co-defendant, Alejandro Hernandez, served more than 10 years on Illinois death row for a murder they didn't commit, before DNA testing proved both men innocent in 1995. Verniel Jimerson and Dennis Williams were sentenced to death in the infamous Ford Heights 4 case in Illinois for a pair of 1978 murders they didn't commit. Jimerson was cleared in 1995 after a decade on death row, and Williams served more than 17 years on death row before he was freed in 1996. Robert Miller spent 9 years on Oklahoma's death row for a murder and rape he didn't commit before he was cleared by DNA testing in 1998. Ron Williamson spent a decade on Oklahoma's death row for a murder he didn't commit before DNA testing secured by the Innocence Project proved him innocent in 1999. His co-defendant, Dennis Fritz, was sentenced to life and spent 11 years in prison before DNA cleared him as well. Ronald Jones, an Innocence Project client, served a decade on Illinois death row for a murder and rape he didn't commit before DNA testing proved his innocence and led to his release in 1999. Earl Washington, a Virginia man with limited mental capacity, was sentenced to death after he allegedly confessed to committing a 1982 murder he didn't commit. He served a decade on death row, once coming within 9 days of execution before receiving a stay. He would serve a total of 17 years behind bars before DNA testing obtained by the Innocence Project cleared him in 2000. Frank Lee Smith died of cancer on Florida's death row after serving 14 years for a murder and rape he didn't commit. He was cleared by DNA testing obtained by the Innocence Project 11 months after his death. Charles Irvin Fain served more than 17 years on death row in Idaho for a murder and rape he didn't commit before DNA testing proved his innocence in 2001. Ray Crone served a decade in Arizona prison, including 4 years on death row for a murder and rape he didn't commit before DNA testing proved his innocence in 2002. Nicholas Yaris served more than 21 years on Pennsylvania's death row before DNA testing proved his innocence and led to his release in 2003. Ryan Matthews served 5 years on Louisiana's death row for a murder he didn't commit before he was exonerated by DNA testing in 2004. His co-defendant, Travis Hayes, was sentenced to life in prison and served 8 years before he was cleared in 2007. Curtis McCarty served 21 years in Oklahoma prison, including nearly 18 years on death row for a murder he didn't commit before DNA tests secured by the Innocence Project led to his exoneration in 2007. He was convicted twice and sentenced to death 3 times based on forensic misconduct. Kennedy Brewer, an Innocence Project client, served 15 years behind bars, including 7 years on death row for a murder and sexual assault he didn't commit before DNA testing from 2001 finally led to his exoneration in 2008. Michael Blair served 13 years on death row for a murder he didn't commit before DNA testing obtained by his lawyers at the Innocence Project proved his innocence and led to his exoneration in 2008. Damon Thibodeau spent 15 years on death row in Louisiana before he was exonerated in 2012. A prosecution expert who aided in the reinvestigation of his case concluded that the threat of the death penalty contributed to why he falsely confessed to the murder of his cousin.